looks over, his knee is shattered, his ankle is shattered, his leg is in horrible shape. He is rushed to the hospital, and he decides, trademark Danny Way, he walks out before going to see the doctor. He doesn't even want to know the extent of the damage. And he comes back to the ramp. And while he's in the hospital, the ramp builders are going back at it trying to fix the ramp to make it work better with the humidity. So they're making the ramp bigger. So the next day, right, well, millions and millions and millions, 125 million Chinese people are watching. He can barely walk. He climbs 10 flights of stairs. That second time, he's literally like lifting his legs step to step to step. He's moving slowly. He's breathing hard. His head is hanging down. He gets up to the top, and it looks like he's paging like a cage animal in the video of this, right? He sort of raises one arm to quiet the crowd, puts his board down, shifts his weight forward. Mind you, shattered ankle, shattered knee. And he's about to try to jump the Great Wall of China on a skateboard. And he pulls it off. 5 seconds after his ramp makes contact, he jumps the Great Wall of China. And because it's Danny Way, and because he's not in it for the money or the fame, even though he's got a broken ankle and a shattered knee, he jumps it 5 more times. In fact, he throws a 360 along the way just to make sure that one's not a fluke. He does it again. So Travis Pastrana, who's one of the great freestyle motocross action sport legends of all time, said about that, he said, look, on that ramp with totally healthy limbs, Danny's risking his life. But he destroyed his steering foot and his knee. Once he sets himself on that board, if either the ankle or the knee gives by a fraction of an inch, he's going to fly off the side of the ramp and die. If you want to talk about pushing limits, most people can't even stand on a broken ankle. Danny not only stood, he withstood 4 G's of pressure going into that quarter type, and he did it 3 times in a row. And here's the interesting thing. When you ask Danny about this, as I asked him, you want to know how I did something like jump the Great Wall of China on a fractured ankle, he said. I can't answer that. All I can tell you is what I already told you. When I'm pushing the edge, skating beyond my abilities, it's always a meditation in the zone. So earlier when I said whenever we see the impossible becoming possible, this is exactly what I was talking about. So after scientists figured out, flow is the secret to optimal performance, and we started putting numbers on it, right? How optimal, right? We did it in sports. Then we did it in art and technology. They did it in business also. So McKinsey, the business consultancy, they did a 10-year study of top executives, and they found that top executives in flow report being 500% more productive than out of flow. You got to think about that. That means you could go to work on Monday, spend Monday in a flow state, take Tuesday through Friday off, and you get as much done as everybody else. 2 days a week in flow, you are 1,000% more productive than the competition. It's for these reasons that Forbes once pointed out that the number one management metric people need to know, flow stage percentage, which is the amount of time people spend in flow. It's why companies like Microsoft, Ericsson, Toyota, and Patagonia have made flow the center of their corporate methodology. And the most important thing, though, is it's not just top athletes or big corporations or experts. It's all of us. Ned Hallowell, the Harvard psychologist who coined the term ADHD, is on the board of the Flow Genome Project. He once pointed out, and I love this quote, flow naturally catapults you to a level you're not naturally in. Flow naturally transforms a weakling into a muscle man, a sketcher into an artist, a dancer into a ballerina, a plotter into a sprinter, an ordinary person into someone extraordinary. Everything you do better in flow. From baking chocolate cake to planning a vacation to solving a differential equation to writing a business plan to playing tennis to making love. Everything you do better in flow. Flow is the doorway to the more most of us seek. Rather than telling ourselves to get used to it, that's all there is. Instead, learn how to enter into flow. There you will find, in manageable doses, all the more you need. So flow is all of us performing at our best. So after we figure out how optimal is optimal, the next question is, where is all this coming from, right? And this is where neuroscience has caught up with us. So for those of you who are familiar with Moore's Law, right, 1965, Gordon Moore, a couple years before he founds Intel, notices the number of integrated circuits on a computer chip had been doubling every year, year and a half, and he's blown away. He's like, wow, this means every year and a half my computer gets twice as fast, but the cost stays the same. It becomes twice as powerful, but the price is the same. And he says, this is amazing. I'll bet this lasts 5 more years, 10 more years. Well, as we know, that Moore's Law has lasted for 60 years. It's the reason why the smartphone in your pocket is 1,000 times cheaper, 1,000,000 times smaller, and 1,000,000 times faster than a supercomputer from the 1970s. So Ray Kurzweil, who's the head of engineering at Google, their head of artificial intelligence, discovers back in the late 90s that it's not just computers that function this way. Anytime a technology becomes an information technology, right, once you can program it in the ones and zeros of computer code, hops on the back of Moore's Law and it starts accelerating exponentially. And the technologies that have jumps on the back of Moore's Law are some of the most powerful technologies the world has ever seen. Artificial intelligence, robotics, networks, sensors, nanotechnology, biotechnology, neuroscience starts really, really picking up speed in the 90s and the early thousands, right? And this allows flow researchers to do something we've never been able to do before, which is peel back the hood of flow, look inside the brain, figure out where is this state coming from, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about the neuroscience, the neurobiology of flow. Now, if you want to understand neuroscience of anything, then you want to know 4 things. First thing you need to know is neural anatomy and networks. This is where in the brain things are taking place, right? Neural anatomy is, it's in the amygdala, or it's in the hippocampus, or it's in the prefrontal cortex, right? But since things rarely take place in one spot in the brain, right, there's a connectome, the wiring diagram of the brain, so it's network effects that matter, right? And then you want to talk about neurochemistry and neuroelectricity, which are the 2 ways the brain communicates. It either sends chemical signals or it sends electrical signals to talk to itself and to talk to the body, right? So we are going to talk primarily about these 4 categories and what we discovered about flow. Now, the old idea about flow and peak performance, which has been around for, actually, it's a bastardization of a William James quote I gave you earlier, but you know it as the 10% brain myth. This is the old idea on peak performance, which is the idea that at any one time we're only using a small portion of our brain, say 10%, and peak performance, aka flow, it must be the full brain on overdrive, right? And it turns out we had that exactly backwards. First of all, just to clarify, from an evolutionary perspective, the brain is conservative by design. So we would never not use 90% of the brain. That would just make absolutely no sense from an evolutionary perspective. It would be a whole bunch of wasted space, and evolution wouldn't permit that. Besides that, the funnier part is that we had it totally backwards when it comes to high performance. So in flow, we're not using more of the brain. We're actually using less of the brain. It's an efficiency exchange in a sense. So in flow, we need a tremendous amount of energy for focus, for attention in the present, right? Flow only shows up when all our attention is in the right here, right now. So what the brain does is it shuts down non-critical structures and gives you more energy for attention. The technical term for this deactivation of these non-critical structures that shows up in flow is transient hypofrontality. Transient means temporary. Hypo, H-Y-P-O, it's the opposite of hyper. It means to slow down, to shut down, to deactivate, right? And frontality refers to the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that's right behind your forehead. Now, you probably know prefrontal cortex is damn important, governs a lot of your higher cognitive functions. So your sense of willpower, resides there. Your morality is there. Long-term thinking, logical, complex decision-making. All this is the prefrontal cortex, right? In flow, this portion of the brain shuts down. So I want to mention that this idea of transient hypofrontality was first proposed by a Georgia Tech neuroscientist named Arne Dietrich, he's no longer at Georgia Tech, but he was when he came up with the idea. And then it was validated by a Johns Hopkins neuroscientist named Charles Limb. So Arne Dietrich proposed it theoretically. Charles Limb took fMRI and did brain imaging studies, and he did a series of them. First, he looked at jazz musicians who were in flow doing improv jazz, or out of flow just sort of playing standards. And then he did the same study, was repeated with rappers. So they were either freestyling, right, totally deep in the moment, in flow, freestyling, or they were doing kind of standard versus other raps. And across the boards, what they saw is activity in the prefrontal cortex shuts down. Now, this explains a lot of the weird so-called mystical, magical, spiritual qualities of a flow state. Why does time pass so strangely in flow, for example? Time, it turns out, is calculated all over the prefrontal cortex. And as parts of the prefrontal cortex wink out, we lose the ability to separate past from present, from future. And instead, we're plunged into the state that researchers talk about as the deep now. Now, by the way, the deep now, huge impact on performance. Think about fear and anxiety. Most of the things we're afraid of, most of the stuff that scares us, doesn't exist in the right here, right now. Unless you are having a heated argument, an action-adventure sport athlete, or a soldier, chances are the shit that scares you, it's either horrible stuff that happened in the past that you'd like to avoid happening again in the present, or it's some scary stuff that could happen in the future that you'd like to steer around from the present. So as we move into flow, anxiety flushes out of our system because anxiety is not a present tense experience very often, right? This has a huge impact on performance. Same thing happens to our sense of self. Why does our sense of self vanish in flow, or for that matter, in meditation? Self is actually a calculation performed all over the prefrontal cortex. And as parts of it wink out, we lose the ability to perform that calculation. Our sense of self disappears. Again, huge impact on performance. When our sense of self disappears, as I said earlier, our inner critic goes along for the ride, right? That nagging, always on, inner defeatist voice in your head, your inner Woody Allen. When we drop into flow, Woody goes silent, right? Again, huge impact on performance. When this happens emotionally, we experience it as liberation, as freedom. You are actually, biologically, getting out of your own way. Emotionally, that freedom, that liberation translates into performance, right? We have performance benefits. For example, creativity spikes in flow. Why? One reason is with the inner critic turned off, you're no longer doubting every great idea you come up with, right? Those ideas instead are flowing, right? We see the same thing with risk-taking. Risk-taking goes way up in flow because you're not governing yourself as much. Now, sometimes this is fantastic, right? And it can lead in really good directions. Sometimes it's extremely dangerous and can lead in negative directions. In fact, there's a German study that was done a couple years ago that says if you chase flow over the course of a lifetime, your risk tolerances are going to go up and up and up and up. This is why often, by the way, you see artists sometimes really wanting to break with tradition and doing something new, right? Picasso starts off as a traditional painter and suddenly he discovers cubism, right? Some of this is about taking bigger and bigger risks and bigger risks. And we'll talk about why that happens, but know now that risk-taking goes up. Right? Now, you also got to understand what just happened. Right? What just happened? We've got this idea that there are these timeless, miraculous, mystical states. It goes all the way back to Nietzsche, to Heim, to James, to Jung, to Maslow, to Csikszentmihalyi, and suddenly it's biology. Suddenly, what was mysticism becomes biology, right? This is an astounding shift. And by the way, just so you have an idea of how far the biology is along and where some of the subtle differences are, and we're going to come back to this idea later, but I just want to drop it in now. So what is the difference, for example, between flow and meditation? They're both altered states of consciousness. They both seem to have something to do with pulling our attention into the right here, right now. Well, these neural imaging studies have given us a clue. What we see in Charles Lim's study, as I said, the prefrontal cortex gets shut down, right? Completely. In flow, one portion of the prefrontal cortex, the medial orbital prefrontal cortex, becomes hyperactive. What does this portion of the brain do? It does a couple of things, but what's most important for our purposes is creative self-expression, right? In meditation, this part of the brain stays quiet. In meditation, you see transient hypofrontality as well, but you are not expressing yourself creatively. It's not an action state. You're trying to let go of yourself or focus on your brain. So you don't need this part of the brain. It's not active. In flow, because it's an action state, because every decision leads perfectly effortlessly to the next, right? This portion of the brain actually becomes hyperactive. It's really turned on. So this is important as an idea, just so you understand how far the science has come, that we can now start to look at flow versus meditation and start to make intelligent deductions about, oh, they're different because of, and this means, and we'll get to all that later, but I just want you to have the idea that it's going on. And let's jump back into the next bit of flow neuroscience. So we talked about neural anatomy, where things are taking place in the brain. I'm going to sort of leave networks to the side for now. We'll come back to that later. And I want to talk about brain waves, right? Whenever you encounter a stimuli, whenever you have a thought, the brain has an electrical response, right? We measure those responses as scientists with EEG. And we can measure those responses with the EEG down to like the 1/1000th of a second range, right? And this allows us to track how the brain changes over time, which no other technology can do, right? Like if you looked at fMRI, that's kind of a fixed snapshot. Now that snapshot is starting to evolve, and we're starting to get brain scans that can see across time. But if we really want to look at time signatures, we use EEG, right? And EEG measures brain waves, and those electrical responses, they're basically bursts of electricity. It's like throwing a rock into a pond. It creates a wave, right? And these are brain waves, which is what EEG measures. And there are 5 major brain wave types, and each correlates to a different state of consciousness. So the slowest brain wave, right? This is the one with the longest pauses between the bursts of electricity, right? Is delta, right? And this is found between 1 and 3.9 hertz. And this only shows up when we're in deep, dreamless sleep. This is delta. Delta seems to be, by the way, very important for the consolidation of memory and learning. Right above delta, we see theta. This is between 4 and like 7.9 hertz. Theta correlates to REM sleep. It also correlates to meditation. Monks and people who have 10,000 hours of meditation training, their brainwaves have a lot more theta in them. It correlates to insight, and we'll talk about why that is. And it's often associated with the process of novel stimuli, if you care. Between 8 and 13.9 hertz, that's alpha. This is sort of the brain's basic resting state. When we're in alpha, we're calm and relaxed and we're lucid, but we're not really thinking all that much. This is daydreaming mode sometimes. Alpha is also associated with creativity sometimes. Beta is a fast-moving wave. It's between 14 and 30 hertz, and it signifies learning and concentration at the low end and fear and stress at the high end. So if you're listening to my voice right now, and provided I'm not stressing you out too much, you are in beta. That's where we normally are. Now, above 30 hertz, there's a fast-moving wave known as gamma. Now, gamma only shows up in what's known as binding. This is when a bunch of thoughts or a bunch of ideas come together for the first time to create kind of a new thought. It's the laying down of a new neural network. So flow, what the research has taught us, takes place on the borderline between alpha and theta. Now, you don't live there 100% of the time. When you're in flow, your brain is not always at the alpha-theta borderline. It will bounce around. You'll jump up to beta. You'll go to other places, but you will always return to the alpha-theta borderline. Now, the cool thing about this borderline, besides the fact that you could only get there normally, not in flow, if you had years of serious meditation training, more importantly, for creativity. So we talked earlier about gamma. Gamma shows up with binding. It's the neurological signature of the aha moment, of a eureka insight. When a bunch of ideas come together, eureka, I've got it. Well, that aha moment, its signature is a gamma spike, right? Gamma is what is known as a coupled wave. Now, that's a very fancy way of saying it only shows up when the brain is in theta. It's coupled to theta. So you can't get that gamma spike unless your brain is in theta. Now, it is hard, as we pointed out, to be in theta when you're actually awake. It's very, very, very rare. What this means about flow, and this tells us something really fundamental about flow and creativity and flow and insight, is that flow is one of the only times when we are perched on the edge of aha insight at all times. So whenever you are in flow, you are on the edge of having a huge breakthrough insight. So when scientists say things like flow shows up whenever there's significant progress in the arts or major breakthroughs in science and technology, this is why we know that's the truth. And this, by the way, this aha insight work was done by my friend John Koinos at Drexel University and Mark Young-Beeman at Northwestern, really brilliant neuroscientists. So we talked about neuroelectricity. Now we have to talk about neurochemistry. This is the other way the brain communicates. And flow is also the product of neurochemistry, which has a huge impact on performance. In this state, we get 5, possibly 6 of the most potent neurochemicals that the brain and the body can produce. And all of them amplify physical performance, right? They amp up muscle reaction time. They increase strength. By some estimates, as much as 15%, actually. They decrease pain sensitivity. But their bigger impact is cognitively. And so I want to talk about kind of all 5 or 6 of these neurochemicals, and I want to talk about how they impact cognitive performance. And to just give you the brief full list, the neurochemicals that underpin flow, you have norepinephrine, which is primarily known, we feel that, we experience it as either anxiety or excitement. Dopamine, which is the reward drug that we get from taking a risk to do something hard. It's the brain's principal pleasure drug. We also get endorphins. These are pain-killing substances. They're the internal version. They're endogenous opioids. They're similar to exogenous opiates like heroin or OxyContin, morphine. But just to give you an idea of how powerful the internal neurochemistry is, there are about 20 different endorphins produced by the brain, and the most common one, what's showing up in flow, is 100 times more potent than medical morphine. So when we say these are pain-killing feel-good drugs, they're killing a lot of pain and you're feeling really good. You're also getting anandamide. This is the same psychoactive that's at the heart of marijuana, at the heart of THC. Anandamide is another internal chemical that mimics an external chemical. It's another pain-relieving chemical, but it also amps up a bunch of different cognitive functions, which we'll talk about in a second. And you get serotonin. This is the calming chemical at the heart of the Prozac revolution. And you might get oxytocin, the so-called trust chemical or love chemical. We'll talk more about what it does in a minute. But what I want to do to explain kind of the impacts of these neurochemicals on cognitive high performance is talk about the 3 sides of the so-called high performance triangle. And it's called the high performance triangle because these are the 3 sets of skills that most researchers are convinced are most critical to thriving to high performance in the 21st century, in the right here, right now. And that's motivation, learning, and creativity. And we'll start with motivation. Let's just talk about the crisis in terms of just work, for example, the crisis in motivation we're now living through. So Gallup, every couple of years, they do a survey of worker engagement. How motivated are American workers, kind of thing. And the last time they did this, they found that 83% of American workers either are disengaged or actively disengaged on the job. And active disengagement has to be my absolute favorite euphemism in the world, because what it means is I hate my job so much I'm going to go out of my way to sabotage my company. That's insane, right? Now, the other 17%, these are people who have jobs that produce flow, and these are dream jobs, right? These are folks who show up early, they stay late, they love everything they do. It's totally meaningful, they're totally on message and on point. Flow is a huge boost in motivation. Why? I gave you a hint earlier. All 5 of these chemicals are pleasure chemicals. And when I said that endorphins are the internal version of opiates, and the most common endorphin in the body is 100 times more powerful than medical morphine. Well, it's the same across all of these neurochemicals. They all mimic an exogenous street drug in a sense. So endorphins, as I said, are opiates. Dopamine is cocaine, the widely considered the most addictive substance on earth. Norepinephrine is speed, crystal meth, that substance. Serotonin is either MDMA, Molly, ecstasy, or LSD, depending on the pathway in the brain it takes. Anandamide, as I said, is THC. And the real point here is you couldn't actually cocktail the street version of these drugs. You would be comatose. You'd be dead. But the brain cocktails them perfectly. So when McKinsey, for example, found that top executives are 500% more productive in flow, it's because of this feel-good neurochemistry, which is why researchers talk about flow as the source code of intrinsic motivation, right? That's really what Csikszentmihalyi means by autotelic. So learning is the next thing we want to talk about. So quick shorthand for how learning and memory work in the brain is that the more neurochemicals that show up during an experience, better chance that experience will move from short-term holding into long-term storage. This is sort of one of the jobs of neurochemicals. They tag experiences as important, saved for later, right? Flow is this enormous dump of neurochemistry, which is why studies run by colleagues of ours at Advanced Brain Monitoring in conjunction with the Department of Defense found that soldiers in flow, radar operators in flow, snipers in flow will learn 230+% faster than normal, sometimes going all the way up to 470% faster than normal. This is a huge deal. We've all heard about Malcolm Gladwell's sort of retread version of Anderson Erickson's work on 10,000 hours being required for mastery. What the research shows is that flow can cut that in half. So huge boost in learning, huge boost in motivation. Creativity is probably the most exciting thing. So the Red Bull Creativity Project, run by the energy drink company Red Bull, was actually the largest meta-analysis, largest study of creativity ever conducted. They did a meta-analysis of over 30,000 different studies of creativity. They interviewed thousands of artists and creatives, and they came to 2 overarching conclusions. The first is that creativity is the most important skill for thriving in the 21st century. And the second is that we absolutely suck at training people to be more creative. We have no idea what we're doing. We're really bad at it. And the reason is we keep trying to train up a skill, and what we need to be doing is training up a state of consciousness. Flow surrounds the creative process. Without getting into too much geeky detail, creativity is a recombinatory skill. It's what happens when the brain takes in new information or even old information but sees it in a new way, combines it with older ideas, and uses the result to produce something startlingly new. So all of the neurochemicals that show up in flow surround the creative process. So when we're in the state, we take in, and this is primarily thanks to norepinephrine and dopamine, more information per second. So data acquisition goes up. We pay more attention to that incoming information. This is, again, norepinephrine and dopamine at work primarily. So salience goes up. Now, we find faster connections between that incoming information and older ideas, what's known as pattern recognition. So pattern recognition increases. We also find faster and farther flung connections between incoming ideas. This is anandamide at work, actually, right? If you've ever been stoned, and you've had the experience where really disjointed ideas are suddenly linking together in new and novel ways, and you're really excited by the insights you're getting, that's anandamide at work. So lateral thinking, goes up. And on the back end of creativity, the definition of creativity, there's no established definition, but the working definition that most scientists use is the creation of something novel and useful. Now, useful means it's not enough just to have the good idea. You also got to make it public. So on the back end of the creative process, there's risk-taking, right? There's always risk-taking when you make the idea public. All of the neurochemicals in flow surround this process. You get amplified risk-taking, heightened pattern recognition, heightened lateral thinking, heightened salience, and heightened data acquisition, which is why in studies run at the University of Sydney in Australia and at Harvard, we find that creativity spikes in flow 400 to 700% above normal. It's a huge jump. And interestingly, and this was work done by Teresa Amabile at Harvard, that heightened creativity will outlast the flow state. Typical flow state is an hour and a half in length, about roughly, though they can vary wildly. And there's an altruism-triggered flow state known as helper's high, discovered by the guy who created Big Brother's Big Sister, Alan Lukes. And helper's high can sometimes last a couple of days. So these are wildly different, but usually it's about an hour and a half. But Teresa discovered that the heightened creativity will outlast flow by a day, maybe two. So huge, huge impact on high performance. Now, there is a last sort of set of skills. There's actually that high performance triangle should probably be a high performance square, because the last set of skills that show up in all our studies of 21st century skills are cooperation, collaboration, all those social skills. And here, flow also gives us a huge leg up. Why? Same neurochemicals. All of the neurochemicals that show in flow do double duty as social bonding chemicals. So Rutgers scientist Helen Fisher has discovered that norepinephrine and dopamine underpin romantic love. So literally when we are falling in love, that incredible sensation, it's norepinephrine and dopamine. And just by the way, to put things in context, right? Falling in love has got to rank pretty damn high on the most pleasurable experiences you can have here on Earth, right? There are volumes of poetry and literature and music and everything else about this experience. It's so powerful, and yet it's only 2 neurochemicals and flow is 5, just to give you an idea of how potent a state we're talking about. Endorphins, right? These pain-relieving drugs, they also underpin maternal bonding. So the bond between mother and infant, the bond between father and infant, and in adults, it's the bonds between friends. Serotonin, it is a pro-social chemical. It makes people calmer in social situations. Anandamide makes people more open to others and openness to experience and their ideas and other people. Oxytocin is the so-called cuddle chemical or trust chemical, though I have to tell you, it is neither, because oxytocin not only will give you trust and love, it will also give you in-group tribalism. And white supremacy is a byproduct of oxytocin. Those sorts of things. So good and bad at once. And interesting, these social bonding chemicals, so ropes courses, everybody who's ever, worked for a corporation has probably gone to an employee offsite team building where there's a ropes course. What's a ropes course all about? For reasons we'll get to later on, ropes courses are flow triggers, and they're trying to trigger flow because they want these social bonding chemicals. Because if you can put a whole team together in flow with these social bonding chemicals flowing through their brain, you can essentially shortcut the friendship building process. You can shortcut your way to trust and cooperation and collaboration using this chemistry. All right, this concludes our second session. We've gone Maslow through Csikszentmihalyi. We have taken high performance from Nietzsche up through Maslow into Csikszentmihalyi. We have gone from mythology and mysticism to psychology, biology, neurobiology finally. And what we've started to see is that some very, very powerful and familiar mystical experiences, right? If you're on any kind of spiritual path, you've probably had that experience of time vanishing. You've probably had that experience of self disappearing or getting really quiet in meditation. So now you have some idea of where it's coming from. You understand the science of where it's coming from. Later on, we're going to find out how to use that science for our benefit. But now at least some of the mystery has been decoded a little bit and is hopefully starting to make a little more sense.
Sounds True presents Mapping Cloud 9, Session 3, Mysticism Decoded with Stephen Kotler.
Welcome to Session 3, Mysticism Decoded. Now, what we're going to do in our third session is we're going to walk the clock all the way back, right? This is the mystical adventure. And now we want to jump all the way back to William James and pick the story up again with William James and walk it forward, right? As I said, back then there was no separate category for flow. Everything was still mystical experience. And James really did feel that these experiences were fundamental to science. We had to understand them if we were going to understand human consciousness. In fact, one of his most famous quotes is this: "No part of the unclassified residuum of human experience has usually been treated with a more contemptuous scientific disregard than the massive phenomenon generally called mystical. Physiology will have nothing to do with them. Orthodox psychology turns its back on them. Medicine sweeps them out, or at most, when in an anecdotal vein, records a few of them as effects of imagination, a phrase of mere dismissal, whose meaning in this connection, if it is impossible to make precise. All the while, however, the phenomena are there, lying broadcast over the surface of history." And remember, he is talking about everything: flow states, trance states, meditative states, every kind of ecstatic state. So an alcohol-fueled mystical experience, psychedelic-fueled mystical experience, right? And remember that when James was talking about mystical experiences, he said they were psychologically real, right? They changed people. They had long-term consequences, irregardless of the fact that the ideas behind the experiences could be totally false. He was really clear, James was, about the grounds to judge religion and spirituality. He said, "By their fruits ye shall know them, not by their roots," meaning he was a pragmatist, right? And this also led him to realize that all these mystical experiences had 4 overlapping characteristics. Remember, we sort of laid out Jung's characteristics, a little bit of these experiences, and Maslow's characteristics. Well, James also had a list, and he was really the first Western scientist to try to classify what actually went on in a mystical experience. He said there are 4 characteristics that matter. He said, first of all, they're ineffable. You can't talk about them. They exist beyond language, and if you try to wrap them up in language, you're just going to make yourself look silly. He said they were noetic, meaning they're illuminating, they're revelating, they're insight and truth, and they feel realer than real. He also said that these states are states. They're transient, they're brief, they're states of consciousness, not stages of development, right? And he also said they were passive, but he didn't exactly mean passive. He meant that when they happen to us, we feel like we are being steered by powers that are greater than ourselves, that effortless effort that shows up in flow. You're still working really hard, you're really in pain, but it feels like it's moving through you, right? And James, as I said, was a strict Darwinist, right? So even though these ideas won't really come back for another 90 years, he really felt that religion, that mystical experiences, that spiritual experiences, all of them had to either serve an evolutionary function or possibly a sexual selection function, right? So either they helped us survive or they helped us get laid. That's what he thought our spirituality might be useful for, right? And whatever the case, he was absolutely certain there was biology underneath these phenomenon, and that figuring out that biology didn't diminish the quality of the experience, it actually heightened it. So as I said, Freud comes along, these ideas disappear for almost 100 years, but they show up accidentally in the 1930s. And this is where things get really interesting. So in the 1930s, at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal, Canada, there's a scientist named Wilder Penfield. Now, Penfield is going to go on to be one of the most celebrated neurosurgeons of the 20th century, right? That was years away back then. Back then, he was just inventing what is known as the Montreal procedure, which is what made him famous. The Montreal procedure was a radical treatment in epilepsy. And it is when science truly crossed the spiritual divide. So what Walter Penfield was doing was he had sawed open the skulls of epileptics, people who couldn't be treated any other way, and their tremors, shakes were destroying their lives. Their seizures were just destroying their lives. And what he was doing was, while the patient was awake, there are no nerves in the brain and the skull, so you can do this. He was using a glass-handled platinum electrode, and he was working his way through the brain. He was applying a tiny little electrical current to the brain. He was asking the patients to describe what they felt, and then he was recording their answer in a notebook, right? And he would number that spot in the brain and then move a few millimeters deeper and do it again, right? One postage stamp at a time. He became the first person to map the brain. And the cartography was sort of besides the point. What he was trying to do was trigger what is known as an aura. So before an epileptic has a seizure, they experience an aura. Now, this can sometimes be a smell. The smell of burnt toast is actually fairly common. Sometimes they'll see colors, hear sounds, that sort of thing. And so he was trying to trigger an aura. You know, they'll get zigzag lines or bright lights, right? And once you've located the aura, it's an indicator. It identifies the disease portion of the brain. And if everything goes as planned, Penfield can then surgically remove it, right? That's the whole point. It's a radical treatment for epilepsy, but he wants to remove as small a portion of the brain as possible. So he's literally trying to trigger the aura to get there. So back in 1931, right? Things do not quite go as planned. He's hunting for faulty tissue, and he's working his way through the temporal lobe of a patient, a woman. And temporal lobe is the part of the brain that's responsible for sensory processing and emotional association. And suddenly he stimulates this portion of the woman's brain, and she has a full-on vision of herself giving birth to her daughter, which had taken place decades earlier. And she just relives the experience out of nowhere as if it was happening again in real time. Now, nothing like this had ever happened before, right? Scientists knew that electrical stimulation could produce motion, leg twitches, hand clasps, shoulder spasms, right? And some tactile stuff, burning and tingling and numbness. But this wasn't a motor response. It wasn't a sensory response, right? This was a vivid memory. And Penfield's note to himself was, this was a strange moment for her to talk of that previous experience, right? He's still very clinical. But this was only the beginning. Over the coming years, by stimulating the temporal lobe, he produced all kinds of stuff that was far stranger than vivid recall, right? He could produce powerful emotions seemingly at will. The science fiction author Philip K. Dick memorialized this in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is the book that became the movie Blade Runner. And in that book, there's something called the Penfield mood organ that was literally would create moods on demand. But Penfield also started provoking really powerful spiritual feelings and downright mystical phenomenon. Auditory and visual hallucinations, deja vu, jamais vu, out-of-body experiences, cosmic unity, right? Even on occasion, that sense presence, which is sort of like the feeling of a god or a ghost or an angel being there in the room with you. And the interesting thing is a lot of these experiences would overlap, right? Dreams, memories, and hallucinations and out-of-body, they would all rise together, kind of like one bleeding to the other. So it was really hard to separate them into discrete experiences. Now, you have to understand what an incredibly groundbreaking discovery this was, right? Until Penfield comes along, these experiences are like mystics, myths, and madmen are the only people who get to have these experiences, right? We call them paranormal, meaning they're outside the bounds of natural phenomenon. But if dreams and memories are showing up in the same sort of the part of the brain that produces out-of-body experiences and cosmic unity and divine presences, right? And these phenomena are created by neural mechanism, right? Then they are just as normal as beating hearts and breathing lungs. They are a product of basic physiology. Now I'm going to pause here to make an important point, which is none of this science, nothing I'm going to talk about answers the big why question. It just doesn't. Is there a God? Isn't there a God? Who the hell knows? Still no answer to this question in the science. All the science says is if there's something else going on in the universe, it is biologically mediated. We experience spirit through biological mechanisms, which, if you're at all rational and at all interested in a spiritual path, I think should make you feel better about your spiritual path, not less good. A lot of people hear the science stuff and think, oh my God, they're disproving spirituality or mysticism. No, we're not. This is no comment on the validity or the non-validity of the experience. All I'm saying is, hey, there's biology here. That's what I'm talking about. There's biology underneath it. So that takes place back in the 1930s and 40s. In the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, not a whole lot is taking place actually like inside of science proper, right? If you go to places like Esalen, things that are a little more on the cutting edge, you're seeing Gestalt therapy and primal scream therapy and all these kinds of people trying to like invent ways to take Maslow's ideas about self-actualization and make them real, right? But nothing is going on really in the science of mystical experience until the 1990s. Now, we have to talk a little bit about where science was in the 90s because you have to understand what a huge breakthrough some of this stuff is. So, like, in the 1990s, just to give you a simple example, emotions are not real. Emotions are still not a real topic for science, right? In the 80s, scientists like Richie Davidson, who's at the University of Wisconsin, is fundamental to kind of meditation research. We're going to talk about him later. He is pioneering affective neuroscience, this neuroscience of human emotion. But this is not a real topic for serious science. Or for that matter, I graduated high school in 1985, and, I spend a lot of time these days talking to businessmen about creativity and flow and passion and things like that. If I would have walked into a boardroom in 1985 and started talking about passion or flow or creativity, I would have been laughed out. These were not serious subjects anywhere, definitely not in science and definitely, not in business. And what changes is, around 1996, 97, 98, Washington State University neuroscientist named Jaak Panksepp is doing his work, and he publishes a very famous book called Affective Neuroscience. Affective, A-F-F-E-C-T-I-V-E, meaning the neuroscience of emotion, right? And what Panksepp did is he mapped out the 7 basic primary emotions: rage, fear, lust, play, care, panic, and seeking, in rats, in guinea pigs, in chickens, and finally in humans. So suddenly, like Darwin's idea that emotional systems are conserved, suddenly there's proof, and he maps out, almost going neuron by neuron by neuron, these basic systems of the brain. And suddenly, for the very first time, emotions are a real topic. Now, interestingly, towards our topic on the science of spirituality, Panksepp does something interesting in his studies. He decides to see if more spiritual emotions like awe are conserved in animals. So one of the easiest ways to detect awe is through the goosebumps. When people listen to music and have the experience of awe, it's often accompanied by goosebumps. So Panksepp decides he is going to play thousands and thousands and thousands of records to chickens, and he's going to record what their skin does, right? And he discovers that chickens do, in fact, experience awe, and they do get goosebumps, and the music that actually most produces that experience in chickens happens to be Pink Floyd's The Final Cut. So go figure. But this is where we are in the 1990s. So another thing that is going on at this point, so going all the way back to Jung. Jung is the very first person, because of archetypes, all of personality testing starts with Jung. So the big 5, all that stuff, that dates back to Jung. So in the 90s is the very first time that, one, we get a genetic and a neurobiological layer underneath our personality testing. And this is because of the work of a University of Washington in St. Louis psychologist and neuroscientist named Robert Cloninger. And Robert Cloninger comes up with what is known as the Temperament and Character Inventory in 1994. And what is cool about it is it's the very first psychological profile that takes spiritual feelings into account. He's got a category in there called self-transcendence. So self-transcendent means you believe in things like spirit and God and the possibility of becoming oneness with everything and generally are mystically inclined, etc., etc. And what's interesting is he argues that there are three systems underneath it, three neurochemical systems: the serotonin system, the noradrenaline system, which is norepinephrine, and the dopaminergic system. So dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine underneath all spiritual feelings in Robert Cloninger's work. And then Dean Hammer, who's an NIH geneticist, comes along, and while he's wrong about this, he discovers a gene known as VMAT2 that codes for dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin, and he labels it the God gene. Now, this is a big deal. We start the 90s with an absolute hostility for science towards anything spiritual, right? Can't even talk about emotions. Definitely can't talk about consciousness. And yet, in one decade, we suddenly go, oh, wow, spiritual feelings are heritable. There's an evolutionary current to them. They go all the way back. They're real in that way. Robert Cloninger says not only are they real, they're fundamental, and they're heritable, and they're parts of our personality. You can measure them. And Dean Hammer comes along and finds a gene that codes for them. Now, we now know that there are a ton of other genes that code for norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine. And while VMAT2 is a little important, it's definitely not the God gene. And this was an early warning about the arrogance or the mistakes of trying to put too much credence on one kind of genetic discovery. This is something we seem to be learning over and over and over again. It gives you a good idea of where we are in the 90s. The 90s are also a time where we pick up James's idea that religions, that spirituality must serve an evolutionary purpose, right? And so out of this, we get books like Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion and things along those lines. And there's a couple of really big ideas here that get advanced from James, which is one of the explanations for religion and spirituality is we are meaning-making machines. And what I said that earlier, and what that really means is what neurons do at a really basic level is pattern recognition. They link like with like, right? You do that over time, you get cause and effect. You do that over time, you get meaning-making, right? And the byproduct of having a brain that is a meaning-making machine faced with a world that doesn't make sense, faced with volcanoes and earthquakes and things happening, right? One of the things the brain always does is it looks for a cause. Where did that come from? If there's no cause, well, maybe it'll make one up, right? We see this all the time. The brain will often confabulate and make stuff up rather than be confused. Brains do this all the time. So one of the thinking is, oh, we made up gods and goddesses and religion and spirituality because we are a meaning-making machine and we don't like uncertainty. And so this makes us feel much more certain, right? This is also at a time where we are starting, one of the big arguments for religion had always been that evolution can't explain incredibly complicated things like the human eye. Well, this is where we start to figure out that, wait a minute, the eye evolved 17 different ways, and that the human eye turns out to have tons of flaws. So not only is it not a perfect organ, but eyes aren't all that special. After all, evolution has done it 17 different ways, right? So that stuff starts to happen. But we also start to figure out that religion and really spirituality has a lot of social benefits, right? The social support that comes from going to church, going to worship services is really important. And we also discovered that when people think they're being watched, even by an invisible imaginary sky dad, they tend to lie less and behave better, right? So these explanations start to come into gear. And then spinning off the work of Dean Hammer, we figure out that spirituality is heritable. Like 50% of how you believe is passed down. Interestingly, and this is some of my favorite research, and I built a lot of stuff off of this idea, a guy named Peter Bergers at the University of Zurich. He's a neuroscientist. And so remember I said earlier that when we're in flow, pattern recognition increases, right? Our ability to find, like Peter Berger's the guy who figured it out. And what he figured out is that the more dopamine in our system, the more patterns we notice. Now, what does this mean? Well, this means that the more dopamine in our system, the more we're likely to believe in things like conspiracies and gods and demons and spiritual ideas, right? It codes for what naysayers would call magical thinking, and what a lot of people would just talk about as basic spirituality. And he discovered this in a really simple way, by the way. It was really kind of fun experiment. He took faces, pictures of faces, and sometimes they were real faces, like my face, your face, whatever, one face, and sometimes they were scrambled faces. So my nose, your ears, her mouth, and put together made to look like a real face. And then he gave half of his study part, and he showed a big study group these images, and the question was, is it real or is it fake? And then he redid it and gave people L-Dopa, which is a Parkinson's drug. It increases the amount of dopamine in the brain. And with more dopamine in the brain, people saw more real faces, quote unquote, even if they weren't real faces. We detected more patterns where there were none. Now, what we now know is that dopamine and norepinephrine tune signal-to-noise ratios, which is a very fancy way of saying when they're in our system, we notice more signal and less noise. We see more patterns. So when pattern recognition gets turned up in flow, right, we notice more patterns and it's creativity. If this goes up even higher, if you're getting more and more dopamine, now you're starting to get into magical thinking, into conspiracy beliefs, and at the high end, you run into schizophrenia. So it's a continuum, and Peter Berger is the first person who sort of unlocks this continuum. So this sort of gives you the idea for where we are in the 90s, right? There's a little bit of spirituality creeping back into the discussion for the first time. I don't think we're out of the 100-year detour yet, but it's starting to creep back into the discussion, and we're starting to get new ideas and people are talking about it. And one of the coolest bits of research, very controversial, is done by a Laurentian University neuroscientist named Michael Persinger. So Persinger picks up where Wilder Penfield left off, right? Penfield's going through the brain, stimulating different parts of the brain with an electrical current, and he's producing out-of-body experiences and sense presences and other sort of some mystical experiences. Persinger comes along in the 90s, and he builds a helmet. It actually starts out, the first version is literally a converted motorcycle helmet that directs weak electromagnetic pulses towards the right temporal lobe, the same part of the brain that when Penfield stimulated was producing all of these so-called mystical experiences. Well, over 1,000, I think it's over 2,000 people have worn the device, and despite the fact that in the experiment you're always alone in the room when he turns it on, 80% of the people who had this experience reported a sense presence, the feeling of someone, something, a god, a ghost in the room with them. So this earns the device its nickname, which is the God Helmet. And we start getting really interesting, sort of theories for how the God Helmet works. And sometimes it doesn't work, right? There's a very famous, Richard Dawkins, the very famous skeptical neuroscientist, tries it, and he gets no effect. And Persinger claims it's because Dawkins showed up drunk, and Dawkins claims it's because religion and spirituality is bogus, and it goes back and forth. And this is just one of those arguments that scientists like to have with each other. But you have to understand that already we've got